Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our fireside chat titled Cyber Statecraft, the new chessboard of geopolitics. Our moderator is Rima Maktabi, Bureau Chief Al Arabiya News Network. Our speaker is Chris Inglis, First National Cyber Director, White House, United States. Rima, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Rima, for your hospitality.
So, it's a question that's been on my mind. They call you the Cyber Tsar. Are you a Tsar, and why is this name?
Who amongst us hasn't wanted to be a czar at some moment in your life? But no, I'm not typically called a cyber czar, and I'm not sure that that's the right metaphor. I'd rather be called the cyber coach, though that doesn't have the same impact. Because at the end of the day, the role of someone like the U.S. National Cyber Director, which is our nation's response to this, is not so much to create another vertical where you dominate the space and you issue orders that are followed and scripted and executed, but to establish a set of relationships where all of the various capable organizations and the private sector can actually make a contribution. So in that sense, you're more like the coach. You're probably not on the field actually kicking the ball and doing all the things necessary, but you make sure that there's a game plan, that there's a strategy, and if it's not working, it's your accountability, you're responsible to adjust that.
Well, that's how the media in the U.S. called you. I think because you were the first national cyber director in the U.S., it was a pioneer experience inside the US. You've had a front row seat to the evolution of cybersecurity. Tell us, on a global scale and nationally, tell us about that experience and how do we assess the cybersecurity around the world now on the international level?
Yeah, so it's a good set of questions. I'll answer the second question first, which is that I think in a word, it's fragile, right? So we depend massively on cyberspace to do all the things that we want to do in our daily lives, in our businesses. Even national security depends on that. And it's fragile because we haven't made the investments to ensure that it meets our expectations. For 50 years, as we developed the internet and all of the associated technologies, innovation and market efficiency, the ability for these systems to essentially be affordable, they've been the predominant drivers, and safety has always been the poor third child in the corner. And in many cases, we've never had a chance to go back and bring safety along before we've come up with the next innovation, the next market deployment, which means that we've not built resilience inherently into these systems. Mm-hmm. They're then very hard to defend, and oftentimes the people who are expected to defend them are the people who did not build them, they merely inherited them. And so fragile is the word that I would use. But that's not the end of the story. I think that we can, in fact, defend these systems. I love the title of this conference, which is Collective Action. We need to actually be action-oriented. We need to figure out what are we going to do, but it's the collective proposition that actually can make the difference.
Who's stronger, the attackers or the defenders?
Today, for the most part, the attackers are stronger than the defenders. Why? Because the attackers often, they seize the initiative, they choose the time and the place, and they're increasingly acting together. There are syndicates in ransomware where experts who might have an ability to get into your system and then to understand what's in that system and then understand how to negotiate with you about some criminal act, they're different. They have different expertise, and yet they combine their efforts to overwhelm us. We defend alone, typically, in stovepipes and silos. And so you find small organizations or nationally oriented organizations who use limited expertise, limited authorities, limited capabilities to defend themselves against a well-resourced threat. If we in fact turn the tables and essentially respond as a collective set of capabilities, expertise, and authorities, we can in fact hold our own in that space, but we've not been doing it.
If we look at the geopolitical map, what's the most pressing threat now internationally?
Yeah, so it's tempting to say that there's a particular bad actor, whether that's a nation state or a criminal activity, that's the most kind of pernicious threat, the most significant threat. But I think the low cost of entry and the wide use, the wide availability of technology makes it such that that can change on a moment's notice. I'd like to actually reverse the mirror and look back to see, what are we doing on our side? And sometimes the greatest risk in cyberspace is what we are not doing. Not investing in the resilience and robustness of this space, not achieving a degree of collective action. We can, in fact, make ourselves a harder target. We can, in fact, monitor these systems, defend these systems more robustly, more collaboratively, and more than hold our own against the attackers. And so the greatest threat that I think we have is our own complacency, if not our ambivalence. And if we were to change that proposition, we could push strongly back on the aggressors.
If we look at the international scene and the real world versus the cyberspace, is it a unipolar world in the cyberspace or multipolar world?
Well, it's a flat world. It's a flat world in the sense that the technologies, the techniques, the tradecraft are widely available. If you go on the darknet, you can, for a fairly small sum, buy a broad array of attack methodologies. And the accessibility of the attack surfaces, the accessibility of an attacker to find and exploit something that might be a weakness in your digital infrastructure, that's also easy to get. So it's a flat world. It's not a unipolar world, though, in terms of how we think about the defense. It's a heavily siloed world where we act independently within our own stovepipes, imagining that we're solving a problem that might be similar to somebody else's, when in fact it's the same problem.
In your 2022 Foreign Affairs article, the Cyber Social Contract, a very important article, you discussed how information sharing and analysis centers should help or could help nations build resilience against potentially catastrophic cyber incidents. Can this be taken also on the global level? Can nations coordinating among each other? Is there trust?
Well, I think it must be taken to a global level, which I think would then in turn develop trust. Trust is something that is earned as opposed to given. And so if we did in fact combine our efforts to deliver for our citizens what they need, and that should be the focus. What do our citizens need? Not what's the geopolitical faction that we're going to aid and abet. Then I think we can develop that trust.
So let's give examples. We know the U.S. adversaries in the real world. You want to tell me that in cyberspace, your enemies are not your enemies?
Well, I think if you think about the physical world, and if a given nation state, the United States, has competitors or adversaries, then they're going to use cyber as one of their instruments of power. But I would reverse the proposition to say, if you're in cyberspace, do we in fact have a common aspiration to make cyberspace work for all of our citizens? We do. Do we have common threats, adversaries to that proposition? We do. And therefore, it's a more unipolar world in cyberspace than it might be in physical space. And so I wouldn't start with, how do I actually equip a geopolitical faction, some set of alliances, with cyber tools? I'd start in the other place. I'd say all of our citizens deserve to have some confidence that when they flip a light switch, or they cast their vote, or they try to do something for their business in cyberspace, that it will work as intended. All of our citizens. Doesn't matter what the government might be that essentially is serving their needs. Those citizens have a common need. And we ought to organize around that principle. In which case, I think you'd find the global South and the traditional West and the Middle East all finding common ground, common aspirations, and some common challenges. It then can become a unipolar world, at least to some better degree, and we can deliver the trust that's required.
But there's disparity.
Of course there is.
In the cyberspace, similar to the one in the physical world. So is it about allies?
Well, let's take the disparity first. That article that you referred to in the Foreign Affairs Journal was really about that. It says that we have the need for a new social contract. There are haves and have-nots, both in the physical world and in the cyber world. And if we have shared aspirations and if we had shared challenges, then shouldn't we actually kind of create a degree of collaboration amongst the haves and the have-nots so that together we can do something that no one of us can do alone? Because any of us can be the weakest link, but said in a more positive way, each of us has an opportunity to contribute to the collective aspiration of making cyberspace work for us. And so while that article was about a United States proposition, it must it must be considered in an international context. What do we owe each other in order to make cyberspace work for all of us? That's the social contract. So if you're a have or a have not, you still have some responsibility, some accountability to make a contribution to it. Everyone benefits from that. Within the United States, small businesses, which constitute most of our businesses, 95% of our businesses have 25 employees or less, if they cannot afford to mount a stout cyber defense on their own, how do we equip them through the supply chain, through the provision of commodity software, commodity hardware, something that's not simply inherently defensible, but defended by all parties? How do we get that right upstream so that when they inherit it at the point of operation, it's inherently resilient, it's inherently robust, and they can actually do whatever they want to do in cyberspace alongside all the other players? I think that must work in an international context as well.
Data is key for countries, for the private sector, for the public sector. Trust, like how as a country can you trust? And this cooperation that you are talking about, how can you share data whereby each probably side is after your data? So where's the line here?
Well, there's different kinds of data. So there's data that might be sensitive, private, unique to you, and we need to make sure that we defend that, whether it's proprietary or personal or health-related information. But there's all kinds of other information that we must share fully, ruthlessly. Information about best practices, information about threat actors that are holding us at common risk, information about what is critical or what is not critical in a system of interest. And that degree of information sharing allows us to figure out what the right frameworks are, what the priorities within those frameworks should be, how we're actually going to mobilize all the talent in the room to kind of address our aspirations against the common challenges so that we might then defend that last kind of information, which is unique and singular and private and proprietary. But that's only one small class of information.
When you talked about the new social contract in the cyberspace, you also talked about a special relationship between the private and the public sector. Tell us more about that. It's a bold idea, and is it doable?
Nothing short of that is useful, right? So both of those domains, and neither one is monolithic, right? Governments aren't inherently coherent inside of themselves. The private sector is not internally coherent inside of itself, but let's take those as centers of gravity. The private sector, in the case of the internet, is where most of the innovation, the development, the capacity generation, and even the defense takes place. And they must therefore be a full party to understanding how we build it, how we sustain it, how we defend it. But governments, to a point made earlier in the first session today, have unique authorities. They have unique information, they have unique authorities, and they must contribute those to the defense of the whole. That's best done in a collaboration, not in a division of effort. Division of effort is really an agreement to not collaborate. You assign static responsibilities to two or more parties, and they, assuming that the world never changes, that the aspirations don't change, that the threats don't change, they just blindly execute those static responsibilities. We have to have a collaboration where they actually complement one another by sharing without precondition what the aspirations are, what the responses are.
Can we give an example about a successful, probably, cooperation between the private and the public sector in a certain physical attack that happened or cyber attack in the US?
I'll give you an example. So within the United States, we have defined, and this is typical of other nations, but I'll give a US example. We have 16 critical sectors. They've been defined for the last 25 years as things like telecommunications, finance, energy. And any one of those is critical enough that we would try to make sure that we have built-in inherent resilience and it delivers reliably day after day, even in the face of cyber threats. I'll take the finance sector as an example.
Yeah.
The finance sector actually has quite a lot of capacity, given its long-standing history of dealing with threats, to perceive what those threats are, to build in the necessary resilience, and to defend that apace. But it actually doesn't understand all of the threats that might be posed against them by perhaps a nation state that might try to hold the finance sector at risk as a proxy for holding the nation at risk. A government like the United States, with its intelligence assets, might then inform the private sector, this is the true nature of the risk you face. It complements what the private sector might know itself. And it can then provide incentives to ensure that the private sector develops the necessary inherent resilience. And it can work with other nations to ensure that there's a level playing field in terms of the regulations that pertain to these truly international organizations. The complementary nature of what the government can do and what the private sector can do creates a unique proposition where they can create something that's resilient against all threats. If only one or the other worked that problem, you would essentially find a seam in between the two of them that an aggressor could take advantage of.
If we talk about new technologies in the realm of cyberspace, I want to focus in the last few minutes on AI. A lot of talk around this, a lot of fears, a lot of promising ideas for the future. How do you see AI influencing the threat landscape and also the defense systems?
Yeah, so let me first talk about generative AI generally. There's this anecdote that, in a word, the future of AI, generative AI is good. In 2 words, not good.
Not good?
Turns out both of those things are true. And the choice between whether we have a good future or a not good future is not fate, it's choice. We have to actually decide. And I think that we need to think about generative AI as today's representation of a transformative technology. The main thing that is important about it is not what it is, it's the speed at which it arrived and the speed at which it's going to become something else. So we need to think about the speed of the transformation as opposed to the technology of the moment. And if that's the thing, imagine you're a human being standing on the beach as a tsunami wave approaches. You can hold up your arms, try to actually get your arms around it, wrestle it to the ground, stop it at the beach. That actually is not possible. Or you can actually grab a surfboard, turn around and ride that inland. I know that that's actually trivializing, a huge physical phenomenon, but we need to think about how do we ride the wave as opposed to stop the wave. And how do you do that? You have to actually declare what your values are. The values that will endure will that technology serves a purpose to serve the aspirations, the needs of mankind. That's thing one. Two, if that's true, we need to subordinate technology to the human proposition, make sure that the human remains the accountable party. Make sure that we develop critical thinking skills and confidence on the part of the human that they still are the central mechanism in the system. And 3, let's instrument this technology, generative AI or anything that comes after, so that we understand what we've authorized it to do, we understand what it's actually doing, and we have the controls necessary to bring it back into control if it gets outside of its boundaries. We must not develop AI for its own sake. We have to develop because we have some plan in mind of what we want it to do. It doesn't mean that everybody needs to understand what's inside the box. I have no idea what happens under the hood of my car, but I can control it. I've got a steering wheel, an accelerator, a brake pedal.
I just have a minute. You started by saying the offenders are stronger than the defenders in the cyberspace. With AI and the speed of AI, who's stronger?
Well, at the moment, generative AI tends to be more used, kind of more frequently used by the attacker. So that kind of, at the moment, is something where the attackers are kind of ahead of the defenders. But that's not the way it needs to be. We can make use of it to actually defend ourselves, and I think that we will. But coalitions need to come into play where we actually understand what the best practices are in the use of that. How do we actually share those best practices and deploy generative AI for our benefit so that we can stay ahead of the attackers? The good news with respect to generative AI is that while it increases at scope and scale, the things that we already know how to do, it doesn't actually deliver any new and novel techniques. So it can actually be used by defenders to stay ahead of, at least apace with the attackers.
I have so many questions considering what's happening around the world, but the time is always our enemy. And I think we've wrapped up with a new title for you, the Cyber Coach. Not the Czar.
Right.
And that's a new title by the Global Cybersecurity Forum.
It doesn't have the sizzle, but I think that's a more appropriate metaphor for how you should think about cyber. It's wider than it is tall.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here and for attending. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.